speaker is Elliot Brenchley. Brenchley.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah.
And I've always called Elliot. So Elliot was a collaborator attending today. So thank you very much to yourself and your team at Greenberg Labs. Local startup, I guess we'll call it startup, maybe past startup.
Transitioning startup.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a good example of some of the technology companies that are being incubated here in part of the region, like represents today. So I worked really hard with me to kind of figure out the best mix of speakers for today. Hopefully we've got that mix right. So thanks a lot for your help getting those going. I'm going to hand it over to you. So Elliot, basically Greenberg Labs builds intelligent solutions for clients in the cryptocurrency space. And the team at Greenberg is a strong believer in the power of decentralized systems and open source tech. They believe that the blockchain is going to play a role in aspects outside of Bitcoin, which I believe is where you guys started.
Yeah.
But the industry leaders should have a firm grasp on how the technology should and should not be used. We heard that in earlier presentations. So Elliot, he's tasked with listening to the amazing dev team at Greenberg Labs and telling you a story. So he's going to do some storytelling for us now.
There you go.
Thank you.
So I'll just say right off the bat that I apologize in advance. The level of conversation is going to go from here to about here. Julie did me a massive disservice by having that fantastic keynote for us. So thank you so much for your intro, Norm. As Norm mentioned, we are a local dev shop that specializes in cryptocurrency and Bitcoin applications. So we were able to cut our teeth in Bitcoin. We're very, very fortunate in that this is the space that some of our clients use. We fell into it a little bit, so to speak. And, we were very lucky to learn the processes behind blockchain and Bitcoin way back when in 2014. Like ancient times for blockchain and Bitcoin. So we're kind of like the bitter hipsters. We knew it before it was cool. And we kind of like begrudgingly accept the fact that it's becoming a popular thing. But it's gonna be great for everyone, we think. So we're really excited to share our passion for it and to talk a little bit about the current implications of the blockchain and how hype and the discussion around its perhaps somewhat overblown uses in some cases sort of plays into our conversation. So we're going to talk about 5 points today. We're going to talk about how to build blockchain hype, sort of surefire, sort of man the torpedoes, saddle up the horses way that the media is portraying Bitcoin and blockchain as a way that it's going to fix all of the world's problems. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We are going to use a specific example as to an instance where blockchain tech and Bitcoin isn't quite ready for use, and we're going to outline some of the obvious reasons why that's the case. It has to do with remittances in the Philippines, which is very much a low-hanging fruit when Bitcoin became popular. And again, we'll discuss sort of why. We want to talk about what perhaps, sort of from our experience, goes into building a good and usable blockchain, and what industries and startups and other companies can do to sort of get their head around something that might work in future iterations. And we're going to talk a little bit about barriers to entry. So specific reasons why firms should or should not perhaps be getting into Bitcoin. And of course, we'll discuss some good fit implications. So finding hyperbolic headlines wasn't exactly difficult in today's day and age. I pulled a few out for you. The Financial Post wrote that Bitcoin and blockchain can be the start of a bigger revolution than the internet itself. The internet itself. Julie made reference to this in her speech, that there was this, when TCP/IP was sort of shaping the way the web was going to look back in the mid-90s. This is sort of the common link that the media has with describing how blockchain might change how we do things in the future. bigger revolution than the internet itself, that might be a bit overblown. TechCrunch recently described the blockchain as the new Google. I don't know if that's at all relevant. May seem to be a busy month for blockchain hype. The Business Blockchain, which was a recent publication, wrote the blockchain cannot be described as a revolution. It's a tsunami-like phenomenon. And Fortune talked about how here's why blockchain will change the world. We certainly would be remiss without talking about our favorite bit of hype, which was published by our own company back in February, how blockchain could change the world. So, even we are not immune to the hype surrounding this. The excitement sometimes gets the best of us a little bit. By the way, that's the title of our ebook, which you can buy on our site for the low price. Talk to me after this speech. I'll cut you a good deal. Okay, so let's dig right into it. We want to talk about a really, really interesting example of a blockchain idea that sort of fermented in the Philippines a couple years ago when Bitcoin started its sort of rise, and we're sort of calling it the cart before the horse. So essentially, what ended up happening is Bitcoin and blockchain started to become prevalent, and there were some very smart people in the Philippines who decided that this could solve a major problem. And one of the problems, the perceived problem, was with something called remittances. If you've traveled overseas, in particular to Eastern and Southeast Asia, you will notice that there are quite a few Filipino expats living and working in different sort of corners of the globe. And there's a very, very good reason for this. The Philippines, especially the rural Philippines, is blessed with sort of this young and ambitious, predominantly English-speaking population of people who are conversely cursed with the fact that they have to live in the rural Philippines in a typically poverty-stricken environment, and many of these people find their way to different corners of the world, like Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai, and Saudi Arabia are popular places for young Filipinos to basically earn a living wage and send money back to their families in the Philippines. And sometimes, most times, they're living overseas away from their families, so they might be the sole breadwinner for their household. And remittances plays a major role in sort of how they send money back home. So essentially, a very, very large percentage of most Filipino expat wages are sent back to their rural communities, and it's mostly sent through traditional remittance carriers like Western Union and MoneyGram. If you're unfamiliar with Western Union, we're living in an age, shockingly, in which some people might be unfamiliar with Western Union. I know it was a huge global behemoth at one point. Still is quite a large company. They're that company in which, when those really nice-sounding accented people call you from the CRA and tell you that you have outstanding tax balances and that you need to send money quickly using Western Union, that's what Western Union does. And so, essentially, it's a very, very traditional way to send money from one country to another. The perception is that Western Union has very high transaction fees, and it takes a very long time to get from point A to point B. So if you're sending money from somewhere like Singapore to the Philippines, it could take days, and the transaction fees could be as high as 10%. That's sort of the perception. The business of remittances is huge. It's a $500 billion global industry. In the Philippines alone, the World Bank estimated that in 2015 it accounted for 10.5% of their GDP. So it's a huge, juicy red apple that these companies who decided to start implementing blockchain tech and transfer Bitcoin saw as a major, major opportunity, and they basically lined up for a piece of the pie, and certainly we couldn't blame them. The idea is that by sending Bitcoin, it drastically reduces transaction times and fees. That 10% fee, again, as I mentioned, is sort of a common notion as to the amount that a company like Western Union would charge. So they're essentially setting themselves up to offer a value proposition that cuts out the middleman. Really all you need is 2 Bitcoin addresses and an internet connection. So it sounds great. And Lord knows companies are still trying. It's not something in which people have to stop doing. It's, there are very large companies like Rebit and Coins.ph in which, they're trying to basically shake up this environment. And you kind of add to that this idea that, especially maybe in the urban centers, there's this young, progressive Filipino policy towards digital currency even. Digital currency does play a part in a lot of urban environments in the Philippines. I believe that the government itself has a pegged digital currency. So, the everyday lingo in the Philippines tends to sort of lend itself as a sort of a perfect environment in which something like this could take off. So it does seem like a perfect environment for success, except for one little thing, and it has to do with this, the Philippines itself. This is obviously a map of the Philippines. And what you'll notice is that Manila is kind of up here on sort of like a largish land mass, but everything else is completely spread out. And it's mostly spread out via water. And water is not a great mechanism. Essentially, most of the remittances that move into the Philippines, as I mentioned, happen in rural environments. And it can be very, very difficult to separate the idea that what works in Manila, tech-centered, very progressive capital city, might not work in other parts of the country. So we're seeing a problem here, and that problem has a name. It's called the first and last mile. And what the first mile refers to is essentially operating costs. While it's true that, as we know in the startup community here, startups can be a lot more nimble than sort of these great behemoth corporations. We can pivot and do really neat things. At scale, that's not really true. If a startup eventually wants to scale to the size of a corporation, the size of Western Union, they're not going to have that attribute of nimbleness and quickness and other things. So although they're nimble now, you have to sort of account for the fact that if this became sort of a regional trend in the Philippines, that companies wouldn't stay nimble for very, very long. So the first mile starts with operating costs. And that has to do with marketing, salaries, office expenses. Those essentially aren't going to be any different from if you're running a traditional remittance company or a startup. You still need to tell your story. You need to pay your people and have somewhere to do work in. So that's kind of a wash, that sort of brick and mortar concept. There's not much of an advantage there. The last mile is a lot more interesting, in particular when you consider how remittances are completed in the Philippines. This is basically describing the final stage in the money's journey. And when money is sent from somewhere like Hong Kong to a rural environment in the Philippines, it goes from a transaction post in typically official-looking transaction post in Hong Kong. I know I used to live in that region, and they have little Western Union kiosks everywhere where you can sort of go in, fill out your paperwork, send the transaction out. But it arrives in pawn shops typically, and pawn shops are great vehicles for money to arrive in because of the cash flow advantage that they have. There's constantly money moving sort of in and out. And essentially the money goes from being this wire that comes over to someone who acts as an agent at a pawn shop in the rural Philippines, and gets converted directly into cash, and the pawn shop owner hands the cash over to the guy or the person who's receiving the money. And of course, they take a rather large cut. So, one of the reasons why cash is so important, and that pawn shops play a crucial role, is because people typically in these environments don't hold bank accounts. It's either a trust issue or simply a logistics issue as to where they are. So you can kind of see where this is going. Sorry, I went one step too far. You can kind of see where this is going, in that the money needs to move from basically from cash point to cash point, and it's almost absurd to think of someone basically taking Bitcoin from an environment in which maybe it's being sent fine, and the people that are sending it can have the ability and the internet connection and all of the infrastructure in place to do it, to an environment in which it doesn't really arrive correctly, and the people that are taking it in fully understand sort of like how you would convert that from Bitcoin to cash. So it's really sort of a cash problem, and that's essentially what we find as the obvious issue with something like a great idea in which blockchain is going to solve all of these problems, and yet something as simple as rural banking ideas and maybe a lack of internet connection can sort of like stomp that out. So really, like, again, companies are working to fix this. I don't know if it's always going to remain this way in the Philippines. There's certainly a scale of adoption that's improving, but we kind of find that as a really great example of sort of like putting the cart before the horse, and not really thinking through the basic on-the-ground business problems before implementing a plan. So that kind of leads us into our next thought, which has to do with barriers to entry for companies, not just working in the Philippines, but companies that are working anywhere on the blockchain. And the first one that we see is talent. Talent plays a huge role in being able to scale an effective blockchain enterprise. It just doesn't really exist. I was on a Slack thread the other day on it was a blockchain business community Slack thread, and a startup was complaining that they just lost 2 devs from their Austin offices out to the Valley, and these devs, very junior, were getting ridiculous salary offers because they had some expertise in blockchain. And so it doesn't really exist on a massive scale. So if you're trying to set up a dev team and to scale it out, it can be very difficult. The demand far outstrips the supply in this regard. And you add to that compounding factors. Curelet Labs exists in a smallish community here in KW, and for us, culture is usually more important. A cultural fit is usually more important than technical skills. So how do you factor that in? So you've got this group of small group of blockchain qualified individuals that basically you're taking a small percentage of because maybe some of them don't fit into your culture. So there are certainly pains in that regard. The next has to do more with scaling a decentralized system. So basically, you have to think about the idea that you're moving from central data systems where there are gatekeepers, and it's very traditional, and there are traditional ideas centered around that, to convincing these gatekeepers. And I know IBM has blockchain experiments, and there are large companies investing some money in it, but essentially you're having to convince people who hold the keys to the kingdom to open it up to this like conceptual high, this amazing idea that we all know would just be fantastic for the world, but like what true incentives are there for companies to sort of like give up the keys to that kingdom in sort of the public sphere? And there are certainly great examples of private blockchains and ideas surrounding future implementations. I don't know, Rubik's is going to show us something amazing. But when you're talking about sort of like moving from closed central data systems to public decentralization, it gets a bit tricky to have those conversations. Growth pains can be difficult, especially on public blockchains. Julie mentioned Ethereum quite a bit over her topic of discussion. And one of the things that Ethereum is experiencing right now, actually today, I just read an article, a problem with DOS. So they hard forked yesterday. Julie, is that right?
I think so. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. So as these blockchains sort of scale up, they obviously become targets for malicious attacks. The DAO example is a really good example, and it's sort of what's happening with Ethereum now. But from another perspective, from what we're seeing with the Bitcoin blockchain, as a blockchain, essentially, so basically, the Bitcoin recently went through something called a halving event, where essentially the reward for miners securing blocks was basically halved. And that saw some major congestion on the network. So everyone sort of like went into a fluster as to sort of what's the proper amount to sort of tip to make the confirmation move faster and this and that. So there's definitely some disruptive capabilities for larger blockchains as they sort of scale up, and we're seeing that a little bit. So growth pains are sort of a big issue. And then one of the things we like to talk about in the office is the fact that a lemon is a lemon, and as neat as creating a decentralized consensus database for smart contracts is, the information that goes on them in the first place, it is what it is. So blockchains really can't turn bad data into lemonade, lemons into lemonade, and the quality from step one is really an important process consideration. So let's move on really quickly, because I want to talk a little bit about, through our experiences, sort of like what has contributed to good usable blockchains, and where that might fit into future uses. So, of course, not every blockchain has this Filipino example of a roadblock, and there are lots of great ways to use the tech. And of course, one of the ways that we're going to see really soon is the Deloitte Innovation Proof of Concept. But from Greenwood's perspective, there are a couple points that I want to bring up as far as creating good usable blockchains. One is transparency. Industries that need to access huge swaths of anonymous data in one swoop would naturally benefit from a blockchain. So if you think about health records, and if you think about a world in which health records were on the blockchain, so that basically means digital records on a decentralized database, it's a scary thought until you understand that you're not John Smith on the blockchain. You're a string of 30 plus random characters, and researchers might have the ability to use your health data, your anonymous health data, to solve some really big problems that they would never have had the tools for, possibly on a global scale, depending on how the blockchain works. So transparency is a really key thing. Privacy is really closely tied into that. So, you have access to transparent data, but not an identified party. And that obviously gets revealed through a private key, which only one central owner has access to. So privacy is a really key element. Speed, that's been mentioned today. So speed is really about ensuring that complex, high-stake transactions can happen in a relatively short period of time. Typically, in a perfect world, within 1 or 2 confirmations. Obviously, that's dependent on how the blockchain is set up. And it could take very, very little time at all. So public blockchains, as I mentioned, are a little bit different, as we talked about with the halving event. But speed is definitely relative to gated versus public blockchains. And lastly is trust, or lack thereof, or the term that we sort of talk about, which is trustless ledger system. trust is sort of letting go of the idea that a centralized database should securely hold information. I think that the lessons learned through recent data breaches with a couple of major US retailers last year would show us that perhaps centralized databases in their current form are not the way forward into the future, and that at least decentralization should play somewhat of a role in that. So basically, yeah. So to sort of close it out, I just want to talk a little bit about some good fit examples that sort of we've been seeing and we've been dealing with at Greenbrick Labs. Obviously, not every industry is a great fit for blockchain, but banking is one that gets discussed quite a bit. And it gets discussed often within the context of sort of the next generation SWIFT idea. We talked about health data, but public data like land titles and tax information would certainly be stored on blockchains, as Julie mentioned. So one of the things that's really interested as of late is the idea of something called provenance, which is that consumers have the ability to know with certainty that something is what it is when they're buying it. And that seems like kind of a silly thought, because of course, like I know an apple is an apple when I'm thinking about the supermarket, but when you think about sort of the intricacies of buying foreign lumber, for example, or fish that's been sourced from Thailand or the Philippines or wherever, you start to see that there is a supply chain issue with trust and a decentralized system in which, from sort of the first moment of harvest to the last consumer interaction, a fully tracked decentralized system could make a ton of sense. So I certainly thank you for sort of like putting up with me for the last couple of minutes, and I appreciate you coming out to our blockchain event. So thanks very much.
Any questions?
Give me examples of products that you work on that blockchain change the experience of using the product a lot. So I know the blockchain covers the background of the product exists, or is there something you can talk about?
As far as product interaction.
Yeah, product interaction or interaction.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, for us, the really exciting thing is that the blockchain has been evolving and it continues to evolve for us. We certainly, the old adage we have at our company when we talk to people at public events is that basically our NDA is so strict that we'd be killed on the spot if we told you exactly what our clients do. They mostly work in regulated spaces. But from a user perspective, and if I understand your question correctly, from sort of like a user design perspective, it's still a little bit in the Wild West. Julie was right when she talked about how the adoption issues are definitely a problem in this space, and it's slowly improving, but at the same time, the fact that it's a very, very complex system makes it very difficult to adopt in a lot of cases. But we're getting there, definitely.
When you brought up the Philippines, that was really interesting about that. You really do need some sort of infrastructure back end for a lot of these potential applications. Do you see the blockchain as like a leapfrogging technology that can put, say, like developing countries ahead of other countries if they progress the blockchain, or does there need to be that, typically, does there have to be that infrastructure that if you don't have some sort of, you don't have the technology back end, you haven't tested your ideas in other ways, you can't really implement it. I don't know how to explain that.
No, definitely. That makes complete sense. It's a fantastic. We think that it's sort of a fantastic equalizing technology in that regard. I think that your initial idea is more to the point. The grand idea of Bitcoin, as per Satoshi Nakamoto, who no one knows who he is, or if it's a she, was that Bitcoin would change currency in that it would be an equalizing force through economies of the world in which individuals would have some say over their individual or their country's currency policies. So we don't necessarily see it as a major hurdle, especially in somewhere like the Philippines. I think they're pretty much this close, but there are just some basic obvious issues that need to get resolved for them to accomplish it. But we are seeing great blockchain implementations out of the Philippines, and I would expect that some of the best ideas are going to be coming from sort of third world nations that can scale quickly and easily, for sure.
I still have a really basic question regarding the comment you made with the using women. So I was wondering, like, you know, the blockchain is being used to track like assets of diamond and such.
Yeah.
Let's say if the first like information about like let's say an asset like diamond is wrong as we put it on the blockchain, it's going to be wrong forever. Like how does that work?
Yes, so if that initial information isn't correct, so say for example, a diamond was harvested as a blood diamond in the Congo or somewhere, and someone lied and put it on a blockchain-like system as to its provenance, then that lie or that sort of falsehood sort of exists further on down the blockchain. However, what a system like this would eliminate is further lies. So that information is correct or not correct, but that information is secure within the block, and any future iteration, any future sort of like possibilities for other people to add falsehoods onto a product's provenance is eliminated using the blockchain. So there's still that initial instance where you could have some weird thing happen and someone could say that something is, but it isn't. But it all eliminates further manipulation down the chain. That was the question.
We have time.
Sure, one more question, then we'll get on to
It seems that with especially companies, big companies that are entering the space and trying to do their own experiments with blockchain, and you may know a lot more about this in your line of work, that although blockchain can have many different characteristics, anonymity, immutability, etc., it seems that especially big companies may want to pick and choose which features they want and which features may not be so useful to them. For example, in like permissioned environments.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on whether that ultimately is good for the tech, whether it hurts the tech, and whether that's going to ultimately change how we even understand what a blockchain is?
Mm-hmm. It's like having a point-by-point standard for what goes into making a great blockchain is an important first step. Julie had a list of criteria in her presentation, and we certainly have sort of an idea from our end. And you're absolutely right. I think that the hype has distorted the fact that people think that this is a fix-all issue, and I can just imagine the kinds of conversations that go on in big Toronto boardrooms where people say, okay, we're going to invest in blockchain, but I don't really like this element. I don't like the decentralized element. Let's not use that. Like this, there's some really weird conversations. What were we saying, Norm, the other day? There was this blockchain implementation in which you were able to basically change the data.
patent by some company or something.
Right. I didn't name them.